One of the final segments is the idea incubator. In this, I ask my guests to share a concept or a theory or piece of work that they have that's had a profound impact in their life and they would like to share with other people. So, in this segment, I would love to know more about your work on the appearance of multiracial faces and how that's affected by the names that are assigned to them. And you have used the case study of Barack Obama.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So this was a study I did years ago, and that was part of my honors thesis, actually, which then became my PhD thesis. And so I was looking at because my research supervisor, he's a forensic psychologist, but a research forensic psychologist who looks at face recognition and how that's relevant in things like eyewitness evidence, immigration processes. So if I've got a photo of you in your passport and I'm looking at you, how good am I? And how hard is that task to actually determine if this face is you or somebody else? So how useful CCTV images are at actually identifying a person in the population and all of these things. So he gave me some different studies to look at to explore what my potential research topic might be. And one was a study that looked at, they took multiracial faces. So they were half white, half black. So this is a US study. And they morphed them together to get sort of as ambiguous a face as possible in terms of racial identity. And then they labeled the faces in a memory task. They labeled the faces as either black or white. And they found that when the face was labeled black, when people rated the face, they rated it as having more archetypal black features. Like they would rate the nose as being wider and the eyes as being further apart and the skin as being darker and the lips as being bigger and all those things, even though it was the exact same face compared to when it was labeled white. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. But I thought, well, but we don't walk around with labels that I don't wear a shirt telling people that I'm white, for example. And then I thought, but our names are often very indicative of our cultural identity. And so rather than let me replicate this study, and being in Sydney, in Australia, our two dominant student populations are Asian, like Oriental Asian, so Chinese versus Caucasian. So I thought I'll create my own faces. So I went around taking photos of male students around the campus and morphing these faces together with different software. And then I did some pilot testing to get people to rate the faces without any labels. And I picked the faces that were rated as being a very 50-50 split in terms of how the person looked. And then I did research on like the most common names, boys' names in China and in Australia, both in terms of boys' names, but also the most common surnames. So Lee in China versus Smith or something in Australia. And then I randomized as people were exposed to these faces, they would either be labeled a very Chinese sounding name or a very Australian Caucasian sounding name. So Andrew Smith versus Huang Li or something. And I found sort of a similar pattern there that if the face was labeled with a Chinese name, then people saw the face as looking more Asian than if it was labeled with a Caucasian sounding name. And so people go, well, why is that interesting? They go, well, then often the name is sort of your immediate impression of people, and that's going to sometimes influence how you then interact with that person. And so I know, like with my own name, Kiran, that's a name that's quite confusing to people because I know there's Kiran, which is Indian, and then the way that I spell my name is Kirin, which is Japanese. So if people have gotten an email from me, but also there's Kiran, which is in Ireland is a boy's name. So people, if they don't see me like through an email correspondence and then they meet me and they go, oh, you were not what I was expecting you to look like. And so you go, oh, and I've noticed like when people realize that, like even the language that they've used in emails switches once they realize that actually I'm a woman or I'm Caucasian or something. And so that can help set the stage for how we then interact with people, and how much we think, there's this whole in-group versus out-group nature of how we interact with people and how much cognitive effort we put into recording their face to memorize it later, because my research was looking at the own race bias in face recognition. So we're better at recognizing faces from our own racial group. So it's that whole they all look the same to me effect. So in my study, I used Barack Obama as like a case study, in that his name is Barack Obama, but his mum's maiden name is Dunham, and he went by Barry when he was at university. And so it's like, like when he was campaigning, what might have been the reaction if he had chosen to campaign under the name Barry Dunham as opposed to Barack Obama? Because that sets up very different expectations. And so I find that that's very interesting, because if that's the case, then that is my argument. What I explored in my thesis is this one of those factors that contributes to how we then interact with people, because even things like their name and how they might dress and stuff signals to us their cultural identification.